The working-class lifestyle under the factory system, with its new forms of social control, was a radical break with the past. It involved drastic loss of control over their own work. The 17th century work calendar was still heavily influenced by medieval custom. Although there were long days in spurts between planting and harvest, intermittent periods of light work and the proliferation of saints' days combined to reduce average work time well below our own. And the pace of work was generally determined by the sun or the biological rhythms of the laborer, who got up after a decent night's sleep and sat down to rest when he felt like it. The cottager, who had access to common land, even when he wanted extra income from wage labor, could take work on a casual basis and then return to working for himself. This was an unacceptable degree of independence from a capitalist standpoint. In the modern world, most people have to adapt themselves to some kind of discipline and to observe other people's timetables, or work under other people's orders. But we have to remember that the population that was flung into the brutal rhythm of the factory had earned its living in relative freedom, and that the discipline of the early factory was particularly savage. No economist of the day, in estimating the gains or losses of factory employment, ever allowed for the strain and violence that a man suffered in his feelings when he passed from a life in which he could smoke or eat or dig or sleep as he pleased, to one in which somebody turned the key on him, and for 14 hours he had not even the right to whistle. It was like entering the airless and laughterless life of a prison. The factory system could not have been imposed on workers without first depriving them of alternatives, and forcibly denying access to any source of economic independence. No unbroken human being with a sense of freedom or dignity would have submitted to factory discipline. Stephen Margolin compared the 19th century textile factory, staffed by pauper children bought at the workhouse slave market, to Roman brick and pottery factories which were manned by slaves. In Rome, factory production was exceptional in manufactures dominated by freemen. The factory system, throughout history, has been possible only with a workforce deprived of any viable alternative. The surviving facts strongly suggest that whether work was organized along factory lines was in Roman times determined not by technological considerations, but by the relative power of the two producing classes. Freedmen and citizens had sufficient power to maintain a guild organization. Slaves had no power, and ended up in factories. The problem with the old putting out system, in which cottage workers produced textiles on a contractual basis, was that it only eliminated worker control of the product. The factory system, by eliminating worker control of the production process, had the advantage of discipline and supervision, with workers organized under an overseer. The origin and success of the factory lay not in technological superiority, but in the substitution of the capitalists for the workers' control of the work process and the quantity of output, in the change in the workman's choice from one of how much to work and produce based on his preferences for leisure and goods, to one of whether or not to work at all, which of course is hardly much of a choice. Margolin took Adam Smith's classic example of the division of labor in pin-making and stood it on its head. The increased efficiency resulted not from the division of labor as such, but from dividing and sequencing the process into separate tasks in order to reduce setup time. This could have been accomplished by a single cottage workman separating the various tasks and then performing them sequentially, i.e., drawing out the wire for an entire run of production, then straightening it, then cutting it, etc. Without specialization, the capitalist had no essential role to play in the production process. If each producer could himself integrate the component tasks of pin manufacture into a marketable product, he would soon discover that he had no need to deal with the market for pins through the intermediation of the putter-outer. He could sell directly and appropriate to himself the profit that the capitalist derived from mediating between the producer and the market. This principle is at the center of the history of industrial technology for the last 200 years. Even given the necessity of factories for some forms of large-scale, capital-intensive manufacturing, there is usually a choice between alternate productive technologies within the factory. Industry has consistently chosen technologies which de-skill workers and shift decision-making upward into the managerial hierarchy. As long ago as 1835, Dr. Andrew Ure, the ideological grandfather of Taylorism and Fordism, argued that the more skilled the workman, the more self-willed and the less fit a component of a mechanical system he became. The solution was to eliminate processes which required peculiar dexterity and steadiness of hand from the cunning workman, and replace them by a mechanism so self-regulating that a child may superintend it. And the principle has been followed throughout the 20th century. William Lazonick, David Montgomery, David Noble, and Catherine Stone have produced an excellent body of work on this theme. Even though corporate experiments in worker self-management increase morale and productivity, and reduce injuries and absenteeism, beyond the hopes of management, they are usually abandoned out of fear of loss of control. Christopher Lasch, in his foreword to Noble's America by Design, characterized the process of de-skilling in this way. The capitalist, having expropriated the worker's property, gradually expropriated his technical knowledge as well, asserting his own mastery over production. The expropriation of the worker's technical knowledge had, as a logical consequence, the growth of modern management, in which technical knowledge came to be concentrated. As the scientific management movement split up production into its component procedures, reducing the worker to an appendage of the machine, a great expansion of technical and supervisory personnel took place in order to oversee the productive process as a whole. The expropriation of the peasantry and imposition of the factory labor system was not accomplished without resistance. The workers knew exactly what was being done to them and what they had lost. During the 1790s, when rhetoric from the Jacobins and Tom Paine were widespread among the radicalized working class, the rulers of the, quote, cradle of liberty lived in terror that the country would be swept by revolution. The system of police state control over the population resembled an alien occupation regime. The Hammonds referred to correspondence between North Country magistrates and the Home Office, in which the law was frankly treated, quote, as an instrument not of justice, but of repression, and the working classes appeared conspicuously as a helot population. In the light of the Home Office papers, none of the personal rights attaching to Englishmen possessed any reality for the working classes. The magistrates and their clerks recognized no limit to their powers over the freedom and the movements of working men. The vagrancy laws seemed to supersede the entire charter of an Englishman's liberties. They were used to put into prison any man or woman of the working class who seemed to the magistrate an inconvenient or disturbing character. They offered the easiest and most expeditious way of proceeding against anyone who tried to collect money for the families of locked-out workmen, or to disseminate literature that the magistrates thought undesirable. Peel's bobbies, professional law enforcement, replaced the posse comitatus system because the latter was inadequate to control a population of increasingly disaffected workmen. In the time of the Luddite and other disturbances, Crown officials warned that to apply the Watch and Ward Act would be to put arms into the hands of the most powerfully disaffected. At the outset of the wars with France, Pitt ended the practice of quartering the army in alehouses mixed with the general population. Instead, the manufacturing districts were covered with barracks as, quote, purely a matter of police. The manufacturing areas came to resemble a country under military occupation. Pitt's police state was supplemented by quasi-private vigilantism in the time-honored tradition of black shirts and death squads ever since. For example, the Association for the Protection of Property Against Republicans and Levelers, an anti-Jacobin association of gentry and mill owners, conducted house-to-house searches and organized Guy Fawkes-style effigy burnings against Paine. Church and King mobs terrorized suspected radicals. Thompson characterized this system of control as political and social apartheid, and argued that the revolution which did not happen in England was fully as devastating as the one that did happen in France.